and welcome to Geography with Miss Whittaker. Today we're going to talk about how a river changes for its long profile and its cross profile. Now rivers move water from upland areas to their mouth and the sea. And there are three things that rivers do along that journey from the source in upland areas to their mouth in the oceans. They erode. The process of eroding is called erosion. That means that they break things down. So the rivers carry things. The things that a river carries is called its load. And in that load there are going to be large materials or large sediments and smaller sediments. And as the load is moved from the upland areas down to the mouth, it gets smaller and rounder. But rivers also do another thing. They transport material, they move it from the upland area to the sea. Transportation. And finally, rivers do one more important thing. Rivers don't always have the energy to erode and transport material. So sometimes they deposit material, and we call that the process of depositing material, deposition. Now we're going to look at each of these in turn, and first we're going to start off with erosion. Now remember, erosion is the breaking down of material from large to small and round. And it happens in four ways. The first way is hydraulic action. Hydraulic action. Now hydraulic action is just the breaking down of material by the force of the water. So if you stand in the shower, you can feel this in a really basic way. You can feel the water against you, and if you turn your shower onto that jetty setting that some showers have, it becomes quite strong. It becomes even more obvious if you have a power washer. And if you've ever put water through a power washer, that has real force to it, and that's why they used to clean things, because they've got such power that they wash away the mud and the dirt. And over time, the force of the water erodes material, it breaks it down. And this mainly happens at waterfalls. There is a second way that rivers break down material. This is called abrasion. Abrasion happens when load that the river is carrying, so things that are in the river, scrape against the river bed and they scrape against the river bank. And abrasion is a bit like sandpaper. It's where you scrape against something and it breaks it down and makes it smaller and smoother. Rivers also erode by a process called solution. Solution is when water dissolves rocks, because water is actually slightly acidic. So when water comes across rocks with calcium carbonate in them, like limestone and chalk, it's able to dissolve them. That's a bit like what happens when you have a cup of tea and you put a sugar cube in it. The tea dissolves the sugar cube. The sugar cube stops being a solid and it is dissolved by the hot solution. Rivers also erode by a process called attrition. Now, all of the previous processes of erosion that we've just talked about, they act on the river bank and the river bed. So remember, we've got our river. The sides of the river are called the river banks, and the bottom of the river, that's the river bed. So hydraulic action, abrasion and solution act on the river banks and the bed. Attrition is a bit different. Attrition acts on the load, so it acts on what the river is carrying. And attrition is just where particles smash together. And when they smash together, just like what happened with my pen then, they break up. And they get smaller and rounder. So, by these four processes of erosion: hydraulic action, abrasion and solution, the load that a river carries gets smaller and rounder as it moves from the upland areas to the sea. But how does that load actually get moved? Well, it gets moved by the processes of transportation. And there are four processes of transportation. Depending on how heavy the load is, it will get moved by a different form of transportation. So really heavy loads, we're talking like big boulders that are found near the source of the river, they get moved by traction. Now traction is literally the process of the river pushing those big boulders along the riverbed. And it tends to only happen when the river's got loads of energy, which is when it floods. You can think of it like you're trying to carry a really heavy, massive shopping bag. And it's so heavy you can't even pick it up. So what you do is you just push it along the floor. Slightly less heavy material gets moved by a process of saltation. And what happens is that when the river's got energy, these particles are picked up, and then the river loses a bit of energy in some areas, so they go back down to the riverbed. And what happens is they basically bounce along the riverbed. You can think of that like, this time you've got your shopping bag and you're able to hold it for a bit. It's not quite as full as the last one. But after a while you get tired and you have to put it down again. So it gets picked up and then it gets put down again. That's saltation. Really small particles get moved by a process of suspension. Suspension. So here, with traction and saltation, the load is being moved along the riverbed. In suspension, the load is being moved in the water because it's light enough for the river just to carry along. That's like you've got your shopping bag and it's a happy weight, you can just carry it along. The fourth method that a river transports its load is called solution. And you'll notice I haven't drawn any particles in solution because solution happens when rocks are chemically dissolved in the water and they get moved as part of the water. What we find is that as a river moves from its source, because the load is getting smaller, at the start near the source, most material is moved by traction, and then as we move towards the mouth of the river, most material is small enough to be moved by suspension. So let's talk a bit more about those changes that happen to a river from its source to its mouth. When we look at a river, and we're looking at the whole length of a river, we call that the long profile. And the long profile is looking at how a river changes from its source to its mouth. When we look at a river cross-section, so when we look at like a slice of the river, and we look at how the shape of the river channel changes, that's called a cross profile. So there are two ways of looking at a river. The long profile, which looks at the whole length of the river, and the cross profile, which looks at little slices of the river channel. Now the cross profile of the river changes along the long profile. What do I mean by that? Well, we can divide the long profile into three sections. Where the river is near its source, we call that the upper course. Then we move into the middle section of the river, we call that the middle course. And then we move into the lowest part. It's now almost at sea level, so we call that the lower course. In the upper course, the river channel is V-shaped. In the middle course, the river channel gets wider and deeper. In the lower course, the river channel is much wider and much deeper. So in the upper course, the river channel might only be 5 to 6 metres across, whereas in the lower course we're talking about kilometres across. You'll notice in the upper course I've drawn a V. In the upper course, the river channel flows in a V-shaped valley. In the middle course, we have a more U-shaped valley because the river, next to the river, there is a flat area of land called the floodplain. In the lower course, this floodplain gets much wider. So, why do these changes to the river channel happen? Why is it going from being really small to being deeper and wider? And why is the valley shape changed from V-shaped to U-shaped? Well, remember we talked about how the load of a river gets smaller. So the load in the upper course is going to be large. And it's going to be much larger than the load in the lower course. And we said that because the load is so large in the upper course, it tends to get moved by traction. It tends to get moved by rolling along the riverbed. Whereas in the lower course, because the load has been eroded and it's much smaller, it gets moved by suspension. Well, if you've got a load of really large boulders that are being slowly moved across the riverbed, what do we think is going to happen? Well, let's draw that out. We've got our, let's see, we've got our river flowing through an upland area here. It's very small, it's only several metres across. And we've got our large boulders that are scraping away out of the river floor. They're going to erode that riverbed, the riverbed, by abrasion. What happens over time is that they're scraping away, they keep eroding it, and it gets a bit deeper. But those boulders, they keep on scraping at that river floor, and it gets a bit, that riverbed, be careful, like I'm not being. Remember that it's the riverbed, not the river floor. They keep on scraping at the riverbed until we get a very deep V-shaped valley with a small river channel at the bottom. And because that erosion has happened by abrasion, and it's scraped the valley deeper and deeper and deeper, we call that vertical erosion. Whereas, in the middle and lower course, what tends to happen is that the river doesn't erode down, it doesn't erode vertically, it erodes the banks. And most erosion in the middle and lower course actually happen when the river bends, when the river meanders. We call that process of erosion of the banks, widening of that river channel, we call that lateral erosion. Now, one of the strangest things about rivers is that when you look at them in the upper course, they look like they're flowing really quickly. There's a lot of white bits on the water, and you might hear a lot of the sound of the water flowing. And that makes you think that the water's travelling really quickly. Whereas in the lower course, the water looks really smooth, and you can barely tell it's moving just by looking at it, unless you look really closely. But actually, The water in rivers travels much quicker in the lower course than it does in the upper course. Let's look at why that is. So we said in the upper course we've got a small river channel. Here's our very small river channel, and it's in a V-shaped valley. And in that river channel are large boulders. Because those boulders haven't had a chance to erode yet. So the water flowing through that channel has to find its way around all these boulders. There might be other bits in there as well, other parts of the lake. It's flowing through all these different things, and it's flowing, and can you see it's not flowing in a particularly smooth way? We call that turbulent flow. Turbulent flow. And at each point the water has had to flow past a bit of the load. A bit of friction has slowed it down. So when a river is turbulent, there is a lot of friction which slows the river down. Let's look at the river channel in the lower course then. Got our wide river channel. So what's the load of the river like in the lower course? Well, it's going to be small because it's been eroded by hydraulic action, abrasion, solution and attrition. So the water doesn't have those big boulders to flow past, so it can flow in a smooth way. So there's not as much friction between the water and the load. And if we look at where there is friction, the only place friction can occur is along the banks and the bed of the river. So what we find in the lower course is that the river flows faster. It has a higher velocity because the flow is smoother, and smooth flow we call a laminar flow. Great. So what we've gone through today is those three processes that a river does along its long profile. We've gone through the types of erosion, hydraulic action, abrasion, solution, attrition. We've talked about how a river transports its material and how that might change from the upper course to the lower course, transportation. And we know that the river transports by traction, saltation, suspension and solution. So what's the final one? Is deposition. So what is deposition then? Well, deposition is when a river doesn't have enough energy to transport its load anymore. That might happen for several reasons. Remember we talked about friction between the bed and the river channel. Sorry, between the bed of the river, the banks of the river and the water flowing in it. If there is a particularly shallow area of the river, there's going to be a lot of friction. That's going to slow the water down. Just like the water in the upper course gets slowed down by friction. If there's a shallow area, so it slows down. That causes deposition because if water is slower, it's lost its energy. Anytime the river slows down, it's going to deposit material. And what we'll talk about next lesson is the impact that deposition has on river landforms. Thank you very much.